Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmerced.com with some commentary about billionaires. Just because I saw a couple pieces talking about billionaires, sort of the sort of anti-inequality, anti-billionaire sentiment that's sort of really kind of alive in our discourse nowadays. And I just wanted to kind of comment on it. The first piece that I saw was like something like spend Bill Gates' money. So like they show like Bill Gates has $90 billion, and it shows you all these things you can buy, and you could buy, and basically you could buy like all the NFL teams, do all these things, and you'd still have lots and lots of billions left over. Then there was another thing where people pointed out where they said this is how much Jeff Bezos makes per second. Now, I don't know if they came up with that number based on his net worth or his actual annual income. Again, numbers can be misleading. And let me get into that. So when people say someone is like, you see this a lot, especially with like the Walton family. People are like, oh, they're worth billions, and their employees are only paid so much. The first thing you have to really point out is that when people talk about someone as a billionaire, they're not saying that their income is billions. They're saying that their net worth is billions of dollars. And net worth doesn't mean you have this pile of cash that's just sitting there. Okay, so when we say Bill Gates is a $90 billion net worth, it doesn't mean he has this $90 billion that he could literally just spend. It doesn't work that way. I mean, granted, he probably does have access to quite a bit of liquidity where he could pretty much, and when I say liquidity, I mean the ability to actually get cash, that he could pretty much buy what he wants. This is true. Okay, now, so, that being said, what people actually have access as liquidity is probably a more relevant number, because most of what their assets are, most of their net worth is tied up in assets. So, for example, the Walton family, most of that net worth is tied up in Walmart stock. So you can't literally, if people are saying, oh, the Walton family should use some of those billions of dollars to pay their employees, they're literally saying they should sell Walmart to somebody else who may not necessarily be as generous or maybe worse as far as how the company runs, or how lean and mean they want to run the company, to pay, like, the stock in Walmart is not Walmart's money in a sense. It's like if you told me to sell my stuff to go, like, they're basic. You're mixing definitions. Again, stock in the company is not money that the company has. The billions of dollars worth of stock. Again, stock is not something you can pay your bills in. You can't pay your taxes in stock. You can borrow against it. You can take out a loan against it from a bank and pay it back in interest. But it's not money you have to pay for things. You'd have to either sell it or borrow against it to actually have cash. Okay, so you're basically asking someone to sell their stuff to give the money to other people. That's an odd thing to ask. And again, the point really is that when someone says billions of dollars, they don't actually literally have billions of dollars. They have to either sell their assets or take out a loan against their assets, which can oftentimes affect the value of those assets. Because when we hear Microsoft is worth X amount, that's on paper. That's assuming that there's somebody who's willing to buy it at that price. Okay? So when you see a stock price is being sold for so much, it's based on actual transactions that have happened now, based on the number of shares that are currently being sold and being bought in the market. That's not every single share available. If let's say Bill Gates were to sell all his Microsoft stock, the value of Microsoft would plummet because there'd just be too many shares and not enough buyers. So then what would happen is that $90 billion would quickly become a lot smaller number. So he would have lost his net worth. There's less money for everybody. There's less value for everybody, because of some sort of weird, anti-billionaire sentiment. Again, the point is to understand that how these things actually connect. Next point is, most billionaires aren't even using most of their money, which I think most people understand. But when the money sits in, let's say, a bank, again, the money's going to sit in many different places. And then most of it's not money. Most of it's assets. So it might be stock in Microsoft, stock in Walmart, stock in Amazon. In that case, basically, really the only reason they have money is because the thing that they're working to build is worth something, not that they actually have the money. Or maybe they have money that they've earned, they cash that they've decided to invest in stocks in other companies, which means those companies are making use of that money to build things that people want and need. Maybe it's sitting in a bank, and that bank then lends it to somebody to buy a house, or lends it to somebody to do a company, or even it gets invested in derivatives. You'll hear people say, well, yeah, they have all this extra money, but then they put it in, the bank just puts it in all these risky derivatives. That means you don't understand what derivatives are, okay? Derivatives serve many different roles. One, they help mitigate or manage risk, okay, which allows there to be more investors. For example, derivatives include things like options, futures, credit default swaps, and this allows investors to offset risks of investments. The benefit of this is it allows investors, people who have money to invest, to be willing to invest more of it, so that way more people can start companies because they're able to mitigate the risk with these other tools, and then allows investors who do have a higher risk appetite to take on that risk from the investors who don't have that risk appetite, which means there's more investors in the market, there's more capital spread through the market. Like when money goes into a derivative, it doesn't stop there. It's like a layer of risk. It's really what you're doing is imagine that there's capital, and then there's all the different businesses, homes, all the different enterprises that capital goes into. In the middle, there's a layer of sort of risk redistribution. That's derivatives. But money doesn't stop there. It's essentially going through this layer. The risk of all these investments is being redistributed based on choices that investors make through these derivative contracts. But the money is still, at the end of the day, is getting to someone to buy a house, someone to start a business. It's not just stopping there. And people who kind of talk about it that way don't understand how that works and are talking out their rear ends. Now, on top of that, people will go, well, fine, but how about 2008 and how all those derivatives blew up? Again, misunderstanding what happened. Yes, the derivatives blew up, but the problem wasn't necessarily the product of the derivative. The problem was the misprediction of risk. Okay, people expected that risks in certain areas of the economy were a lot less than they were, and ended up willing to sell beyond, basically be willing to be the insurer against a lot more risk than they should have. And a lot of people took a lot more risk than they should have because they mispredicted the risk. Now you have to understand how that happens. They mispredicted the risk mainly because of a lot of different financial models that basically, and then those financial models are based on historical information, and particularly regarding houses. And the reason why housing data was allowed the risk to be understated was mainly because the housing market's been manipulated for the last 100 years by government policy that's always kind of protected the housing market. So if you have 100 years of data that makes, and again, you're not sitting there looking at, well, this policy was established this year, so that's why the trend kept going up. No, you're just looking at the straight data most of the time, without thinking what's going on historically every year. So you're just seeing this upward trend of data. So of course you're going to underpredict the risk. And this is sort of what happens when you prevent bad things from happening. Okay, which is a lot of times what housing policy try to prevent housing dips, because housing is big politics. If you're a politician, house prices fall. That's less money for the local schools because of the property tax. That's homeowners who can't borrow against their equity to make up for whatnot. It's a political win to always push house pricing up. So everyone always pushed for that politically. But the result is, since there was never house pricing dips, or they were always less pronounced than they otherwise would have been because of policy locally, statewide, and federally, this created a sort of historical record that basically undercounted the risk that actually existed. Okay? It's kind of like if every time you crashed your car, your parents just bought you a new car. Okay, then one day when your parents are no longer around, or your parents don't have money to buy a new car, you're going to be really shocked that you actually have to suffer the consequences of your accident. That's essentially what happened in the economy. And also in that same scenario, you'd probably become more and more, there'd be moral hazards, you'd become a more reckless driver because the risk of having an accident is underpronounced. And that's what happened in the financial industry. The culture became more risk prone, or had a grander risk appetite unknowingly, because everyone thought the risk was actually less because the data didn't accurately capture reality because of policy. That doesn't excuse people making bad choices and taking risks, but you have to understand the entire context to understand how you prevent it going forward. That's why you need real market prices and real market trends. Market prices need to go up and down. The economy needs to have expansions and recessions that happen naturally, because it's those periodic downturns that kind of incentivize people to constantly be prepared and to think about tomorrow and, plan for a rainy day. Okay. Yes, it would suck if it rained every day, but if it was sunny every day, none of us would have umbrellas, and the one day it rained, we'd all be screwed. Okay? This is why you need ups and downs. And the government always has a tendency of trying to push against the downturns, which makes when they can't push against that downturn that much worse. And that's sort of kind of what happened in 2008. The pile-on of risk from several recessions that never were allowed to play out, the dot-com bubble, long-term management, all these different things, manifested to a point where they couldn't really push. The old tools just didn't work anymore, or didn't work as well as they did. Okay, and that's always sort of the inevitable story. But this isn't some, conspiracy of a bunch of billionaires. It's like, oh, because we're billionaires, we have a lot of money, and the whole world fell apart. That doesn't make sense. That is not logical. That is not consistent with reality. Cool. So in that case, again, you want to prevent, future not future downturns. There always will be downturns, but if you want to prevent larger depths, you can't expect that government should be playing the game in reducing the frequency. There is a relationship between frequency and magnitude. Okay? So let me restate that once again. Frequency and magnitude. The more often bad things happen, the more people are prepared for them because they expect them. The less often they happen, the less people are prepared because they don't expect them, which means when bad things happen, it's that much worse. I'm not saying we should cause bad problems more frequently, but we should let the natural sort of cycles that occur locally, regionally, nationally, as far as economics to go, allow a natural economic phenomena to happen. In the same way, weather happening as it will, because you can't literally control weather. People don't sit there and say, oh, the government needs to control the weather. People just learn how to adjust to different weather situations and be prepared for all weather situations. Okay? And allows those situations to be less worse for them. But again, the point is, it's not about a bunch of rich people going out and playing in a casino. You have to understand the cultural context. Okay, so other complaints that people have about billionaires, they'll say, well, okay, fine. Maybe they're not the ones who ruin the economy. Maybe, that money is going into the economy. But they have so much political power. And this is true. Okay, it's not the only way you get an inequality of political power is something that just happens. And it doesn't happen just because you have more money. It could happen because of your status in society. For example, if you are a celebrity or you're just any kind of really well-known person, you're going to have unequal political power. If you are a member of the media, like a very popular news show host or TV show host, you are going to have unequal political power because you're going to be able to influence more people. Okay, now people who are billionaires, yes, they can buy more political ads, they can fund more candidates, but that is not the only thing that ends up swaying political influence. Because yes, a lot of political ads can affect a lot of voting behavior, but also can be the influence of the influential, of tastemakers, such as media, celebrities, very, very well-known or very powerful religious figures, community, and oftentimes it does come down to like the local community leaders who can oftentimes determine the outcomes of a lot of these things because they curry favor with people. This is the nature of politics. That's unavoidable. Everyone could have the same wealth. There's still going to be people with unbalanced political influence because more people like them, okay, or people listen to them for whatever reason. Okay, so there's always going to be sort of political imbalances that occur, and But yes, money can being a billionaire can sometimes add to that, and that isn't an unfair critique, an unfair concern. But then you have to think about what would balance out the scales. Then you have to start thinking about really what's driving these sort of massive inequalities that can create. Because if you have a very wide inequality, you could have some troubling political imbalances. Doesn't mean you should get rid of all inequality. Doesn't mean all inequality is bad. Okay, inequality does serve a function in certain purposes. For example, someone who is a computer programmer makes significantly more than someone who is a barista. Okay, and there's some clear differences. And it's not about effort. Okay, oftentimes you get paid less for the jobs that require the most effort. It's about value. It's about the things that society wants and needs, and who is able to provide them. Okay, and supply and demand. So it comes down to just straight up economics. So when it comes to software, okay, there's a demand for ever improving software. But the circle of people who can produce that software and produce it well is finite. It isn't enough to satisfy the demand for that. And then plus to create more programmers takes time. Okay, it's not something that you can just learn overnight. So in that case, there's a high payout because there needs to be an incentive, one, to undergo the effort to go through the training and learning to become a programmer, and also to incentivize there to be more programmers, or else if they got paid the same as a barista, everyone would choose to be a barista instead. It's a lot easier. As far as what you have to learn and time taken off and all this stuff. Okay, so so the differences in income oftentimes are to incentivize things that are needed. Okay, and then people will point out, well, what about that CEO who gets paid like $100 million a year? Okay, and there are different arguments regarding that as far as what a CEO brings to the table. Again, you have to understand sort of what the role of a CEO is. Yes, they are not. Let's say you're like the CEO of Microsoft. You're probably not the person doing the programming. A lot of those little things, a lot of those technical skills that make the things work, probably are not what you're doing. Yet you get paid a lot more than that programmer. You might, if you're the CEO of Microsoft, you're probably making maybe even $100 million a year. More. So what justifies that? Well, I mean, one, the CEO is responsible for the whole enterprise. If the CEO doesn't do their role is to kind of see the big picture. And if they don't see the big picture and kind of move all the pieces of the enterprise, well, everybody suffers. Everybody makes less. And on top of it, there's laws like Sarbanes-Oxley that put a lot of risk on the CEO. They have to sign off on the financials, and they're completely liable for anything the accountant does. Now, does this all justify their pay? It depends. Okay, and there's different studies that show different things, and it shows that having a good CEO can make quite a difference, and what a CEO gets paid relative to competition can make a big difference in the quality of CEO you get. It's a harder thing to measure because it's very much based on non-tangible skills. It's really about your ability to kind of take a look at a whole enterprise, see all of its inputs and outputs, and see how you can fit them together better. That's what makes a good CEO versus a bad CEO. Their ability to appreciate everything. Bigger firms, it's harder for anyone to be a CEO. It's kind of like it's harder for anyone to be the president of a country like the United States because it's just too big. It's just too many moving parts, which makes it unmanageable. This is why, as a libertarian, I'm generally for smaller institutions and do believe in a more free market environment. All institutions, nations, businesses would just naturally be smaller for a variety of reasons. But in most cases, again, that difference is incentivizing, hey, we need more of this. And again, if everyone was a barista, I mean, there's only so many Starbucks out there. So that would, eventually you have a bunch of people who are struggling to, and then you actually drive the cost of a barista even lower. So there's reasons for this. Cool. But the thing is that there are things that drive inequality even larger than it probably should be. And we should think about those things, such as, one, the cost of opportunity. In general, it really just comes down to the cost of opportunity, because the people who who could most benefit from making more money, basically the poorest, they're not the people who are going to have the money to necessarily go take 6 months off to go, one, pass a licensing exam and do all sorts of these kind of things. So occupational licensing increases inequality. Now, if you're in the middle class, you can probably afford to take the time off. It might be a struggle. You might have to cut some pennies out of your budget, but you can do it. Now, if you're that single mother on welfare, you can't take the 3 months off to go train. So in that case, you're just doing whatever you can to just make ends meet, and there's really no hope for improvement because you have this barrier in front of you. You can't go into these other career areas. So occupational licensing increases inequality. Okay, now that might be, a nuisance for people with higher income to have to go get a license, but, to them, it's not as much of a sacrifice. So then those opportunities are going to be more available to them. Starting a business has a lot of red tape around it as far as paperwork you have to file, taxes you have to pay, regulations you have to follow. And yes, if you're rich in the middle class, it will probably be very annoying to have to follow all these regulations, pay these taxes and whatnot. But again, if you're poor, that's just out of the question. So now starting a business is no longer an opportunity for you to advance yourself. Okay, or the businesses that you could start become very limited, becomes hard to compete. This is why a lot of businesses, larger businesses, end up advocating for regulations because they're big enough to be able to absorb the cost, but all their smaller competitors can't. So they know that newer regulations will end up forcing out their competition, giving them greater political power and greater economic power. Okay, so you generally want a freer market if you're trying to dissipate political and economic power. And 3, also just the ability to invest. Okay, so when you tax investments more, again, it creates a couple of different things. One, let me reframe this. Okay, if you make it harder to invest in smaller companies, which is what the effects of laws like Sarbanes-Oxley does, then those smaller, better, higher return investments aren't available to people who make less. That's one aspect of it. But also there's another effect that should be taken into consideration, less to do with inequality, more to do with just economic stability when it comes to investments. People have the wrong idea about how people behave. People think that people just make decisions purely based on their self-interest. It's not quite how it works. Yes, people have things that they want and they do what they can to get them. But the story isn't just reward, it's risk and reward. People will do what they can to get what they want within the risk that they're willing to take. Okay? So most investors aren't looking for the highest return possible, they're looking for the highest return possible within the risk that they're willing to take. Cool. So now we established that. So now imagine this. And they're looking to invest to have a return that is worth the time that they're foregoing that money. Because when you invest in a stock or you buy a bond or you put your money in a savings account, that's the money you're not using right now. So you're only doing it because you're going to get rewarded for it. Otherwise, you might as well just go buy stuff now. Cool. So if you tax investments more, there's a chance that you might push the return after taxes below what someone might be willing to accept in order to take a certain level of risk. Okay? Or, which means that capital, that enterprise will just not get its, will not be able to raise capital because it's not worth it for investors to raise capital because they can't give them enough of a return after taxes to justify that investment. Instead, what's going to happen is that those investors are going to go look for investments that have a higher return to make up for what is taxed. Oftentimes, that correlates with risk. So what you're doing is you're saying, hey, the safer business that would have, absent the taxes, generated enough of a return to justify investment. Now, after taxes, it doesn't. So now you're going to push all those investors into a riskier business. Or you're going to push that business to have to cut corners, take risks that it otherwise wouldn't take to be able to increase the return to justify it. Because again, investors, they're not sitting there saying, oh, this business. They're saying, okay, there's all these different businesses that I can invest in. There's this much risk that I'm willing to take, and there's this much return that I want to have at least after taxes, after inflation. So when you increase inflation through loose monetary policy, when you increase taxes on investments, you end up pushing investors towards more risk. You end up pushing business owners towards more risk and cutting costs and running businesses, and oftentimes pushing them to focus more on efficiency, which some inefficiency is good, but sometimes when you're just trying to cut costs because it's either that or the business closes, then what happens? You start pushing workers to work too hard, and you create a situation where it's harder to have that sort of better corporate culture that'll lead to a long-term growth of the company. Okay, and this is what happens. Okay, it's partly because everyone is making these decisions. Okay, and all the well-wishing in the world doesn't change sort of the calculus that people make, which is just natural. I mean, we do this in every decision we make. When we decide to hang out with this friend versus that friend, or decide to buy this product versus that product, we're all assessing what we want, what we think we're going to get, and what we think we can possibly lose by making that decision. So, to summarize what I hope you took away from this is, one, billionaires aren't some magical entity that's just hoarding all the money, doing nothing with it, and controlling the economy. To the extent that there is imbalances of political power, we need to take a look at actual causes of inequality relative that are usually related to controls in the economy. Think about sort of how policy can distort the whole relationship between frequency and magnitude that hurts individual economic prediction, and also how increased costs from government policy can push people to take more risky behavior, and also create all sorts of misallocations of how capital gets moved in the economy. You may want to listen to this episode once or twice because we did cover a lot, but this is Alex Merced from alexmerced.com. Have a great day and enjoy.